The train groaned to a halt in the middle of nowhere. 12 women sat inside, motionless, their hands folded over their laps like children in church. Their uniforms, gray cotton dresses with U.S. Army stenciling, were stiff with salt and sweat. Behind them, shattered Germany, collapsed certainty, and a name they had been told since childhood not to speak with softness, America. Before them, Texas, endless horizon, barbed wire, dust, and silence. They had been warned, not by the Americans, but by their own officers, back when there were still officers. They had said the Americans were animals, that cowboys were rough men who chewed tobacco and shot at women for sport, that no German soldier, especially a woman, should ever let her guard down in an American prison camp, and certainly not on some ranch. But here they were. The guards told them this wasn't a camp. Not exactly. This was something different. A work detail, unusual, remote. The U.S. Army had struck a deal with a local cattleman who needed labor. They were to help process linens and cook meals for the field hands in exchange for basic rations and housing. No fences, no towers, just a distant white farmhouse, a red barn, and open land from the edge of the world to where the sun vanished. The women did not smile, even as the American driver hopped off the truck, tipping his hat, shouting, "Y'all hungry? We got roast on." Even as one of them, frail Ilse with a bandaged hand, whispered in German, "Roast? On a Sunday?" And another replied, "They're mocking us. This is a trick." No one moved. Only when the guard, Corporal Daniel McBride, 22 years old, Tennessee-born, cheeks freckled and eyes tired, nodded with a quiet kindness and said, "Ain't no trick, ma'am. Sunday's just Sunday." Then, slowly, they climbed down, one by one, boots to dirt, no chains, no shouts, no dogs. Just the creak of the farmhouse screen door swinging, the scent of warm bread on the wind, and a pot roast simmering inside a kitchen they had never imagined would be open to them. And still, they didn't believe. Inside the farmhouse kitchen, everything smelled like home, but not their home, not Germany. It was another kind of home, one they had seen in smuggled photos or cracked propaganda reels. Clean aprons, cast iron pans, a Bible open on the table, not for show. A calendar marked December 1944. The box around Sunday carefully inked with a cross and the words, "Dinner, pot roast." To Helga, the eldest of the 12, it felt like a stage set. Too perfect, too warm. There had to be a catch, had to be something waiting behind the curtains. But the Cowboys came, tall, weathered, quiet. They filed in after morning church, boots scraping the floorboards, hats doffed respectfully, hands scrubbed clean. And then, as if it were the most normal thing in the world, they nodded at the 12 enemy women and said, "Please, eat first." The women froze. There had been no gunshot. No order, just an invitation to pass the roast, to scoop potatoes, to pour fresh milk into chilled tin cups. Sabine wept quietly and could not explain why. Out on the porch, the ranch owner, Thomas Harlan, age 54, Civil War veteran's son, Baptist childless, rocked slowly in a wooden chair. He smoked a pipe and watched the scene inside with a distance that could have been weariness or wisdom. When asked later why he did it, why he let 12 enemy women sit at his Sunday table, he simply replied, "Because the Lord saw fit to give me food I didn't earn, peace I didn't deserve, and a warm fire I didn't build." What kind of man hoards that? To Harlan, Sunday wasn't about country. It was about grace. None of the women understood that yet. But they felt it. The first bite, hot meat, tender and soaked with thyme, collapsed something inside them. It wasn't just food. It was the warmth of being served instead of ordered. It was the shock of kindness that demanded nothing. It was unbearable. Hilda, who had lost a brother on the Russian front and been told Americans were worse than Bolsheviks, dropped her fork. An American rancher reached across the table, gently picked it up, and placed it back in her hand without a word. That night, when the 12 were shown their sleeping quarters in the loft above the barn, blankets neatly folded, clean hay on the floor, and even a jar of soap with a handwritten tag that said, "For the ladies," they no longer spoke, not from fear, but because their words were gone. Every certainty had cracked. What war had told them no longer fit the shape of the world they now walked in. And tomorrow was only Monday. The 12 women stirred at dawn, not to the bark of a command, but to the crow of a rooster, the low hum of a windmill, and the hiss of something holy, hot water being poured into a metal basin. The scent drifted up through the boards, soap, steam, and coffee. For a long while, none dared move. It felt like waking inside someone else's dream. Below, in the kitchen, Corporal McBride was boiling water on the stove, sleeves rolled to his elbows, sweat darkening the cotton at his shoulders. He whistled tunelessly as he set the enamel pots in a line. When he saw the first German woman step down the ladder, Elsa, the seamstress from Hamburg, he simply nodded and said, "Morning, ma'am." No rifle, no bark, just that soft Tennessee drawl. One by one, the others followed, each cautious, each pretending not to stare at the curious sight before them. A young American soldier heating water for them, for their hands. At the far end of the kitchen table stood the object that stole their breath. A large white bowl, chipped along the rim, filled with steaming water. Next to it lay bars of soap wrapped in brown paper stamped U.S. Army issue. Elsa whispered, "For us?" McBride shrugged lightly. "Well, it ain't for the cows." The women laughed, or half-laughed, startled by the sound of their own voices. Laughter had been in exile too long, and in that single human sound, the air in the room changed. The invisible line between enemy and host, captor and captive, wavered for the first time. McBride poured another kettle into the bowl and nodded toward the window. "Sun's warm today. Best wash up before breakfast." They hesitated only a moment. Then Elsa stepped forward. She rolled up her sleeves, lowered her hands into the steaming water, and gasped. It was almost too much. Not from the heat, but from the shock of memory. Years since her hands had felt clean water without fear of ration, without guilt. As the soap foamed and the dirt slipped away, she felt the trembling begin. Small at first, then spreading through her chest until tears mixed with the water. McBride looked away, pretending to adjust the stove. Behind her, the others followed. Helga, Sabina, Ilsa, Greta. Soon the sound of quiet washing filled the kitchen. Water splashing, breathing soft, the crackle of the fire. The simple rhythm of ordinary life, once impossible, now alive in the hands of prisoners. Outside, Thomas Harlan leaned on the porch railing and watched the wind move through his fields. He had seen the same motion in another life. Wheat bending under the blast of cannon near Saint-Mihiel in 1918. He'd come home then, built this ranch, sworn he'd never see another war touch his soil. Yet here it was again. Not in the form of destruction, but of deliverance. His wife, Mary Ellen, had passed 2 winters ago. Her apron still hung on a nail by the stove, her handwriting still on the Bible pages. And it was she who had first said, long ago, "Tom, the Lord don't measure goodness by the flag you wave." He thought of that now, watching the 12 women through the window. Enemy women, yes, but also daughters, mothers, lost souls far from the graves of their own. When McBride came to the porch, drying his hands, Harlan spoke without turning. "Son, you notice how they wash like it's prayer?" McBride nodded. "Reckon they got a lot to wash off, sir." Harlan drew on his pipe, exhaled slow. "Don't we all?" By mid-morning, the ranch was alive with movement. The women were assigned tasks, not forced, but chosen. Greta and Lotta handled laundry by the windmill. Ilsa cooked beside McBride, watching curiously as he whisked cornbread batter with a rhythm that seemed too gentle for a soldier. Sabine, once a schoolteacher, found herself writing out English words on a scrap of paper: milk, plate, spoon, repeating them softly under her breath. When she mispronounced "thank you," one of the cowboys, Sam Bishop, grinned and tipped his hat. "Close enough, ma'am. That's better English than half the boys I know." The phrase made her blush. She hadn't been called ma'am by an armed man before. By noon, laughter rose faintly through the open windows, awkward but genuine. The sound of fences dissolving. It was something McBride would later say felt like watching winter turn to mud season, ugly but alive. That afternoon, clouds gathered over the plains. The smell of rain swept across the fields. Elsa paused at the window and whispered, "In Germany, rain always meant shelter. Here, it meant something else." The first drops hit the tin roof, soft, hesitant, like the sound of forgiveness learning how to fall. Then came thunder, distant, low, followed by a chorus of cowboys running to cover the hay, laughing as they got soaked. The women watched from the doorway, uncertain whether to step out or stay hidden. McBride looked back, water dripping from his hat brim. "Come on, then," he shouted over the storm. "Rain don't care who you fought for." And for the first time, the 12 German women ran freely in America. Their skirts clung to their knees, their laughter mingled with the downpour, and the sound of boots splashing in red Texas mud filled the afternoon. The fear that had arrived with them on the train began to wash away, not all at once, but in layers, like dirt under warm water. Helga stood still at the edge of the barn, face lifted to the sky, whispering words no one heard. Perhaps a prayer, perhaps just the beginning of one. That night, after the storm, the kitchen smelled again of pot roast. But this time, the women had helped cook it. Their hands, still red from soap and rain, served the food alongside the cowboys. There was no ceremony, no speech, no mention of nations. Only the clatter of forks, the scrape of chairs, and the quiet miracle of people eating together after years of hatred. And as the firelight flickered against the window glass, Sabine noticed something that made her chest ache. Her own reflection beside McBride's, both faces softened by the same glow. Outside, the rain whispered on the roof like a benediction. Tomorrow, they would begin to believe. By now, the 12 women no longer woke with fear. The barn no longer felt like a holding pen, but a shelter. The fields no longer resembled the exile they had been warned about, but a kind of forgotten Eden, rough, unmanicured, but alive. They still called themselves prisoners, but the word had lost its teeth. Elsa folded the blankets that morning and whispered, "It smells like hay and home." Helga smiled faintly. Then maybe home was never where we thought it was. Below, smoke curled from the chimney. McBride had started the fire early. He didn't announce breakfast anymore. He just let the smell of biscuits and coffee drift upward, like an invitation rather than an order. And when the women came down, he simply nodded toward the basin. The steam rose again. Hot water, soap, forgiveness. Rituals repeated not because they were commanded, but because they had begun to heal. Outside, Thomas Harlan stood near the gate with a clipboard, watching a convoy of supply trucks rumble by. The drivers waved, surprised to see German prisoners working freely, unguarded, their laughter rising like wind chimes. One driver muttered, Ain't right. Enemies don't laugh. Harlan didn't answer. He only watched the dust rise and settle again, like judgment that never quite reached the ground. By noon, the sky widened into that merciless Texan blue. The women worked in the shade of the barn, polishing tin plates, repairing torn linens. In the distance, cattle bells clanged like faint church hymns. Sabine sat near the porch, reading an English Bible aloud, each word cautious, reverent. Love thy enemy. She stopped mid-verse, looking up at McBride, who leaned against the railing cleaning his rifle. This line, she said, tapping the page. You all believe it? McBride shrugged, his eyes on the horizon. We try. Some days we fail. Sabine tilted her head. And today? He smiled faintly. Today's Sunday. We try harder on Sundays. The air between them hung heavy. Not romantic, not even friendly. Just two people standing on opposite ends of a world, slowly learning each other's language. That was when the ranch bell rang. Once, twice, then a third time, dinner. The smell of roast drifted again through the hall. Potatoes, gravy, bread split open with steam. It was the same as the week before, yet different somehow. Less ceremony, more communion. The cowboys came in from the fields, sunburned, dusty, their boots leaving dry trails on the floorboards. And without needing to be told, the 12 women began to set the table. Plates aligned, cups refilled, the quiet rhythm of a family none of them ever intended to join. Ilsa, the youngest, hesitated by the window, her eyes drawn to the American flag swaying on the porch. It feels strange, she murmured in German. We serve beneath their flag. Helga placed a hand on her shoulder. We serve, yes, but no one's asking us to kneel, and so they ate. Forks clinked softly, glasses touched, and conversation, stiff, careful, began to thaw. The cowboys spoke about cattle prices and missing horses. The women listened, half understanding, half lost. Then one of the older ranch hands, Joe Talbot, raised a brow and said, How do you say pot roast in German? The question startled them. Elsa stammered, Brayton. Joe tried repeating it, his accent mangling every letter. The women laughed so hard they forgot who they were supposed to hate. That laughter, small, unremarkable, was the sound of a map tearing in half. After lunch, McBride brought out a record player, Mary Ellen Harlan's old Victor phonograph, and set it by the porch. The disc was scratched, the sound thin. But when the first notes of Blue Skies by Bing Crosby drifted across the field, something electric rippled through them all. Elsa closed her eyes. We had this song once, she whispered. Before the war. McBride blinked. You did? Before everything broke? The wind shifted, carrying the melody over the pasture. A few cowboys hummed along. One even began to dance, awkwardly, boots thudding on the porch. Lotta giggled, and without warning, she mimicked him. Barefoot, graceful, turning in a small circle. The others clapped. The song ended, and silence followed. Long, soft, filled with something no uniform could name. Thomas Harlan watched from the steps. He thought of Mary Ellen again. She'd danced once like that, at the church picnic of 1919, barefoot in the grass, with him too shy to join. He smiled now, quietly, letting the past and present fold together like two pages that had finally found their rhyme. When the music stopped, the women helped clear the dishes. They stacked them neatly, dried them by the stove, and stood in a line, waiting for instruction. But none came. McBride only said, That's enough for one day. Go rest. You earned it. Sabine frowned. Earned? We are prisoners. McBride met her gaze. Not today, you ain't. That night, the ranch was silent except for the hum of crickets. The women lay awake in the loft, each tracing invisible thoughts across the ceiling beams. Helga whispered into the dark, "What if the war ends and we're sent home? And home feels strange." Elsa replied softly, "Then maybe this was never captivity. Maybe this was the beginning." Below them, McBride sat by the stove, polishing his boots, listening to the faint hum of their voices through the wood. He couldn't understand their words, but he understood their tone, the soft rise and fall of women rediscovering trust. He looked down at his reflection in the black polished tin and thought of the front lines he'd never fought on, the blood he'd never spilled. Maybe, he thought, this was his war. To keep 12 strangers alive long enough to remember they were human. And outside, beyond the barn, the Texas moon hung over the ranch like a quiet witness. The land that had once known only cattle and silence now held something rarer. Reconciliation in progress. Tomorrow would bring new tasks, more labor, perhaps even new suspicions. But tonight, everything stood still. The women slept with clean hands. The men slept without hatred. And the air itself, heavy with cedar and smoke, felt like it was exhaling after years of holding its breath. Somewhere in the dark, a record crackled again. "Blue skies smiling at me. Nothing but blue skies do I see." It came from the kitchen. Soft, rhythmic, human. A sound older than any border. Helga stood at the counter. Sleeves rolled, arms dusted white with flour. She had found a sack of yeast in the pantry and began to work as if remembering a forgotten prayer. The others watched in silence at first, unsure whether she was allowed, whether this act of creation might break some unspoken rule. But when McBride entered the kitchen, rubbing sleep from his eyes, he only grinned. "What's this? Smells like home," he said. Helga looked up, unsure of the words. She pointed at the dough and said slowly, "Bread. German bread." McBride leaned on the counter. "Can't say I ever had that kind. You bake it, I'll eat it." And just like that, the first collaboration of captor and captive began. Not through politics or peace treaties, but through flour, water, and trust. All morning, the kitchen pulsed with quiet motion. Sabine measured milk, Elsa stirred sugar into a bowl, Ilsa brushed dust off the table. They spoke German softly, broken by occasional English phrases they had begun to memorize. Mix. Warm. Ready. McBride helped stoke the fire in the old cast-iron oven, showing them how to gauge the temperature by holding his hand near the door. "You don't need a thermometer," he said. "The fire tells you." Helga smiled faintly. "Like a person?" He nodded, like a person. When the first loaf went in, the scent filled the whole ranch, thick, yeasty, alive. Cowboys stopped their chores to sniff the air. One shouted, "Smells like heaven!" Harlan stepped onto the porch, chuckling. "Ain't smelled that good since my wife was alive." Inside, the women hovered near the oven, nervous and proud. Bread was no small thing in their memory. In Germany, bread had been life, rationed, fought over, guarded like gold. Now, in America, it had become a message. We are still capable of giving. When the loaves emerged, browned, cracked along the tops, steam curling from each, the kitchen fell silent. Helga sliced one carefully, hands trembling. The crust crackled, the center still soft. She handed the first piece to McBride. He hesitated only a moment, then took a bite. He chewed slowly, then exhaled with a laugh. "Well, I'll be damned," he said softly. "That's the best bread west of the Mississippi." The women laughed. Real laughter now, not nervous, not forced. Even the cowboys joined, clapping exaggeratedly. Harlan stepped forward, removed his hat, and said quietly, "If a loaf like that can cross an ocean and a war, maybe there's hope for the rest of us." Then, For the first time, he sat at their table. Lunch that day was unlike any the ranch had known. There was no separation, no American side and German side. They passed dishes in both directions: bread, beans, roast, jam. Each woman took turns serving, and each cowboy said thank you in his own awkward accent. Ilsa tried to reply in English. "You are welcome." It came out halting, almost comical, but it made them cheer anyway, Sabine whispered. They clapped like children. Helga replied, "Maybe that's why they seem so free." After the meal, Harlan brought something from the living room, an old photograph of his wife, Mary Ellen, holding a loaf of bread nearly identical to the one they had just eaten. He placed it on the table and said, "She baked for the church every Sunday. Said the Lord hides his mercy in small things, like flour." Helga looked at the photo for a long time. Then she said softly, in broken English, "She would understand." And Harlan, eyes glistening, replied, "I reckon she already does." That afternoon, clouds gathered again. But this time, no one feared the storm. The women moved the drying linens inside, laughing as the wind tried to steal them. McBride helped nail the shutters closed while Elsa hummed under her breath. An old German lullaby her mother used to sing before the sirens came. When the rain arrived, it struck the roof with a steady rhythm, like hands kneading the sky. The sound of water against tin blended with the smell of bread cooling on the counter. It was the kind of moment no photograph could ever capture. No historian could footnote. A miracle disguised as ordinary life. As evening fell, the women gathered near the hearth. McBride passed around coffee mugs filled with weak cocoa. He'd saved the powder from his rations. "Ain't much," he said, "but it tastes like peace." They sipped slowly, the bitter sweetness almost unbearable. Sabine broke the silence first. "Back home, they said America was soulless, that you all had machines instead of hearts." McBride smiled faintly. "Guess we fooled them too." She nodded, eyes glistening. "You fooled me." Later that night, when the others had gone to the loft, Helga stayed behind, tidying the counter. McBride lingered near the stove, polishing a coffee tin. Neither spoke for a while. Finally, she said in quiet English, "Why, you kind? We are enemy." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "Ma'am, kindness don't wear a uniform. My mama taught me that. Yours probably did too." Helga's hands paused over the dishcloth. For a long time, she said nothing. Then softly, "No, we forgot." McBride nodded slowly. "Then maybe this is where you remember." The lantern flickered between them, its light trembling against the wood walls. Outside, the rain softened to a whisper, as if the world itself was listening. And for the first time, Helga realized she wasn't afraid to sleep. Tomorrow, they would rise before dawn, not as enemies, not yet as friends, but as something fragile and new. Between them and the Cowboys lay no treaties, no speeches, only bread, still warm, still breaking barriers one slice at a time. She sat by the loft window, bent over a pile of torn denim overalls. The seams had split from long days in the fields, and the Cowboys, proud men though they were, had quietly left the bundle near the porch as if ashamed to ask. They hadn't needed to. Elsa understood. She didn't sew because she was told. She sewed because it gave her hands something honest to do. She had once been a seamstress in Berlin, before the war, before the speeches, before the day they took her Jewish clients away and told her it was normal. Before silence became survival. Now, in Texas, her hands moved the way they used to, pulling needle through fabric like a heartbeat. Each stitch was steady, measured, but one thread caught different, a deep red one. She hadn't meant to use it. It had tangled into the denim unnoticed. But now, too late, it had woven itself into the seam. She froze. Red on blue, blood on uniform. Memory, Sabine noticed. She sat nearby, mending a sackcloth apron. "Elsa," she said gently, "you used the red thread." Elsa stared at it. She didn't answer. Sabine rose and crossed to her, kneeling beside her quietly. "It's just thread," she offered. Elsa whispered, "Not in Germany." Sabine understood. Red had been banners, armbands, ranks. It had also been shame. But before they could speak further, the barn door creaked open. It was Joe Talbot, the cowboy with the crooked smile and battered hat. He walked in slow, respectfully, holding a canteen that needed patching. When he saw the women, he tipped his hat. "Ladies, got a hole needs fixin'?" He stepped forward, handed Elsa the canteen sleeve. Then he noticed the red thread. He paused, looked down, then shrugged. "Ain't never seen a man bleed from thread," he said with a wink. "You fix it, I'll wear it." Elsa blinked. He didn't flinch. He didn't shame her. He didn't ask questions. He just trusted the hands that once made uniforms for a broken empire to now patch a ranch hand's coat. That afternoon, when Joe returned to the fields, he wore the stitched overalls proudly, red thread visible. He didn't mention it once. In the kitchen, Helga stirred stew while Ilsa chopped carrots. The window was open, letting in the breeze and the distant sound of cattle lowing. Ilsa leaned close, whispering, "Elsa is not the same since that red thread." Helga nodded. "She remembers too much." Ilsa frowned. "So do we." Helga said nothing. The stew boiled. Later that day, McBride set out folding chairs under the cottonwood tree. It was a slow afternoon, no deliveries, no storm, just dry wind and sun. He invited the women out with a gesture, saying, "Sit a spell. It's too nice to work." At first, they hesitated. Leisure was a language they had forgotten. But they came. Elsa brought her sewing. Sabine carried a book. Ilsa carried nothing, and it was the first time she let her arms swing freely. The cowboys sat nearby, carving bits of wood, chewing straw, talking little. But the silence wasn't empty anymore. It was shared. Helga finally asked McBride, "Why no fences?" He raised a brow. "You planning to run?" She shook her head. "No, I just wonder." McBride looked out toward the horizon. "Reckon if you wanted to run, you'd be in Mexico by now. But most people don't run from kindness. They run from pain." Helga considered that. Then she said, "What if someone runs because they don't deserve kindness?" McBride didn't answer. He just stood, adjusted his belt, and walked toward the stables. He paused only once to say over his shoulder, "You're here. That's enough." That evening, a package arrived from the nearest town. Inside, 2 new spools of thread, fresh cloth, and something strange. A small tin of rouge. It had been requested weeks ago by Harlan, quietly, on behalf of the German ladies. The local shopkeeper had hesitated, but fulfilled the order. When the women opened it, they stared. Elsa held up the rouge. Barely used, probably old stock. It was the color of dried roses, a shade banned in Berlin unless authorized, a color too feminine for a woman of the state. Ilsa reached for it first. "May I?" The others nodded. She dabbed the faintest circle on each cheek. She looked at herself in the cracked mirror over the sink and gasped. Not because she looked vain, but because she looked alive, Helga murmured. Like before the war. Elsa said nothing. But her hand went to her own face, unconsciously tracing her cheekbones, as if trying to remember who she once was. They passed the tin around like a relic. Each used only a whisper of color, enough to feel, enough to remind. That night, as they lay in the loft, the women said almost nothing. Only Elsa spoke, quietly. "That red thread. I used to think it marked us, branded us. But now, Ilsa turned toward her. Now, Elsa's voice trembled. Now I think it can bind instead of divide. Maybe it doesn't matter where the thread began, only what we sew with it next. Below, the ranch was still. The cows slept, the wind slowed, and in the silence, the stitched red seam in Joe Talbot's pants gleamed faintly under the lantern glow. Tomorrow, Elsa would ask for more red thread, not to hide, but to mend. But peace, like bread, is fragile, and one spark was all it took to shake the foundation. It began in the wash house, a separate shed just behind the barn, where linens were boiled clean over wood-fired barrels. The place always smelled of lye and steam, a sacred space where the women scrubbed silently, turning sweat and soil into folded order. That morning, Ilsa had stoked the fire a bit too high. She hadn't meant to. The logs were damp, and the heat wouldn't hold. So she added more kindling, then left for a moment to fetch clothespins. She returned to smoke. Black tendrils snaked from beneath the door. Someone screamed. By the time McBride arrived, flames were licking the walls. The women scrambled with buckets, shouting in German. The cowboys ran from the fields with canteens, wet sacks, anything they could carry. Sabine fell hard trying to pull a steaming blanket free. Greta, barefoot, stamped out embers with her skirt. It took less than 10 minutes. The fire died fast, but the tension did not. McBride stood in the smoking doorway, boots soaked, shirt clinging to his back. He looked around slowly. His face was calm, but his voice had sharpened. What happened? The women froze. Ilsa stepped forward, trembling. I made too much fire. My fault. He stared at her, unreadable. You lighted on purpose? No. The word struck like a whip. Joe Talbot appeared beside McBride, arms crossed. His eyes flicked to the scorched wood, then to the wet rags on the ground. Could have torched the barn, he muttered. Helga stepped forward. She didn't mean it. It was an accident. Joe didn't look convinced. Accidents don't wait. Accidents burn. The silence that followed wasn't loud. It was louder. Years of suspicion came rushing back in through the smoke. Enemy, saboteur, prisoner. Words no one had said in weeks now hovered again in the air, waiting to be used. That night, the ranch was quiet, not peacefully, but like a room where someone's been slapped and no one knows what to do next. Ilsa sat alone in the barn, her hands raw from scrubbing. She'd insisted on cleaning every charred wall herself. They hate me now, she whispered. Elsa sat beside her. No, they fear you again. It's not the same. Ilsa shook her head. It is. We were almost something new, and I ruined it. Across the yard, McBride sat on the porch, the red thread from Elsa's repair still bright in his lap. He turned it in his hands as Joe came to stand behind him. You believe her? Joe asked. McBride didn't answer right away. Then, I don't think she knows how to lie anymore. Joe scoffed. Doesn't mean she won't. McBride turned. She didn't run when it burned. She tried to save the blankets. I saw her. Joe shook his head. I just don't want this to be a mistake. McBride looked up at the night sky. Then don't turn it into one. The next morning, no one waited for orders. The women rose early, gathered every damaged cloth, every scorched board, every waterlogged towel, and lined them across the fence in rows. Then they knelt and scrubbed the stone floor clean with wire brushes until their palms bled. No one asked them to. No one told them to stop. By noon, even the horses were silent. The air hung heavy with sweat and unspoken questions. It was Harlan who broke the tension. He came out of the farmhouse wearing his Sunday vest, cane in hand. He walked slowly to the wash house, inspected the wall, the ashes, the boards. Then he turned to Ilsa and asked, You learn anything yesterday, child? Ilsa swallowed. Yes, sir. That carelessness can look like betrayal. Harlan nodded. Then he reached into his pocket and held something out. A small matchbook with a faded label. Then light the next fire right. Start fresh. Ilse took it. Her fingers shook. Then Harlan turned, cane tapping steadily as he walked back toward the porch, calling over his shoulder, "The test of home ain't whether it burns. It's whether you rebuild it together." That evening, McBride brought out the old coffee tin again. Weak cocoa, second-hand mugs. The women sat in a quiet semicircle. Joe Talbot approached slowly, awkwardly. He cleared his throat. "About yesterday," he muttered. "I'm sorry I raised my voice." Ilse stood slowly. "I'm sorry I nearly burned your barn." Joe cracked a smile. "Well, reckon we're even then." And to everyone's surprise, he handed her something. A scrap of fabric, her apron, singed but saved. "You still sew, don't you?" Ilse nodded. "Then sew it back stronger, like the rest of us are trying to do." That night, as the crickets sang, the women passed the cocoa tin and looked at each other with different eyes. Not as victims, not as survivors, but as women who had been tested and had chosen to stay. The sky turned black, stars freckling the heavens like reminders. No promises, just presents. The red thread in Elsa's basket had grown short. Soon it would run out. But Ilse held the scorched apron close to her chest and whispered, "I'll stitch it anyway." And when she did, she would use the red again. Not to cover shame, but to prove something had held. Tomorrow, they would rise to clean, to cook, to sew, and something quiet, something unseen, would begin to take root in the ashes. Belonging. But as the Texas wind swept through the fields that morning, it brought with it something that had not touched the ranch in months. Mail. A military jeep arrived mid-morning, tires crackling over gravel. The driver hopped out, tossed a leather satchel to McBride, and sped off without ceremony. Mail, on a ranch full of prisoners, was more than delivery. It was intrusion. It meant the world beyond the fences still knew who they were, where they had come from, and what had been left behind. McBride opened the satchel slowly on the porch. Inside were supply forms, a newspaper, and a single weathered envelope. No return address. German writing on the front, faded but clear. He turned it over twice. Then he knocked on the barn. Helga answered. Her hands were damp from rinsing beans. She looked at the envelope and froze. The name written in neat script was hers. Helga, mit Liebe Anna. She took it without a word. The paper trembled in her hands, like a bird too fragile to fly. Inside, a letter and a photograph. The photo was torn on one corner. Black and white, blurry but unmistakable. A girl, maybe 6, in a wool coat standing in front of a bakery in Lubeck, one hand in her pocket, the other holding a small cloth doll. Helga sank to the barn floor. The letter was simple, a child's handwriting. Mama, I wait for you, every day. Papa is gone, but I am learning the prayers you taught me. Oma says you are with the Americans. Are they kind? I hope they are kind. No date, no explanation, just a child's faith, mailed across oceans in silence. The other women gathered around her, breath held like glass. Sabi knelt beside her. Your daughter? Helga nodded slowly. Anna, I haven't seen her since Dresden, since before. She didn't finish. She didn't need to. Elsa whispered. Does she think you're still the woman who tucked her in at night? Helga clutched the letter tighter. I don't know what she thinks, but she remembered my name. That afternoon, the women hung linens in the sun. Wind snapped the sheets like sails, and in the middle of the clothesline, clipped gently by 2 clothespins, was the photograph. They had placed it there without discussion, the way people light candles without speaking. It fluttered beside the uniforms and pillowcases, one child's face looking out at a war she would never understand. Joe Talbot walked by and stopped. He squinted at the photo. She yours? Helga nodded. Joe said nothing for a moment. Then he reached into his back pocket and pulled out his wallet. From inside, he removed a small picture. A boy, barefoot, standing beside a tractor. That's my nephew. Lost his mama in '42. I send him letters from time to time. He looked again at Helga's photo. We ain't so different, huh? That night, Helga sat on the steps of the barn, the letter folded neatly in her apron. McBride joined her after dark, carrying a cup of warm milk. They didn't speak at first. Then Helga asked quietly, "Do you think children remember the truth? Or only the stories we leave behind?" McBride sipped slowly. "I think children remember how they were held. That stays. That's what matters." Helga stared out at the moonlit fence. "I held her with fear. I taught her the wrong songs." McBride shook his head. "Maybe. But she still wrote to you. That means she remembers something good." The next morning, something changed in the rhythm of the ranch. The women began to use their names again. For months, they had called each other by habit. Surname, rank, number. It was safer that way. Quieter. But now, names began to return. Ilse, Sabine, Greta, Helga, Elsa. Simple names. Once whispered only behind wire, now spoken over stew pots and sewing threads like offerings, as if each syllable restored a little bit of their forgotten selves. When Lotta cut her hand on a rusted nail, she cried out, "Sabine, help me!" Not nurse, not you, but a name. And Sabine ran, pressing cloth to the wound, whispering, "You'll be all right, Lotta." McBride overheard it and smiled. He said nothing. But later, in his ledger, he stopped writing POW female 12. Instead, he listed each one by name, spelled carefully, as if they belonged here. By week's end, a new clothesline was built behind the barn. Taller, stretched wide between cedar posts. On it, instead of uniforms and towels, the women hung photographs, drawings, bits of paper with phrases in English and German. It became something sacred, a place where memory met hope. They called it the Zaun der Namen, the fence of names. Joe carved a wooden sign for it in broken German, the letters uneven but earnest. Wir sind nicht vergessen. We are not forgotten. Even the Cowboys pinned things up, dog tags of brothers lost, prayer cards, poems. Harlan stood before it one evening and said to no one in particular, "Never thought a POW camp would become a place for remembering." Elsa replied, "It isn't a camp anymore." He nodded. "No, it's something else now. Something we ain't got a word for yet." That night, Helga placed her daughter's letter in a wooden box lined with cloth. She tied it shut with red thread, the same color she once feared. Now, it was her offering. She whispered a promise under her breath. "If I make it home, Anna, I'll teach you the right songs." And outside, under a Texas sky swollen with stars, the wind danced through the fence of names, carrying memory, mercy, and the sound of belonging stitched back together. Tomorrow, they would send their own letters. Tomorrow, they would be women with names again. It had been 6 weeks since the pot roast. 6 weeks since the train. Since the uniforms. Since silence. Now, there was color on their cheeks and names on their lips. And one morning, as the sun broke over the mesquite trees, Corporal McBride walked into the barn, holding a bundle of paper. Not orders, not forms. Stationery. Pale sheets stamped in the corner. U.S. Army. POW correspondence approved. Each woman would be allowed to write a letter home. The reaction was not joy. It was fear. Ilse stared at the blank paper like it might burn her fingers. Elsa touched her pen to it, then drew back. Even Sabine, who had taught literature in Bremen, held the envelope as if it carried a curse. Helga whispered, "What do we write when we don't know who we are anymore?" McBride didn't press. He placed the stack of paper on the table, alongside pencils, and simply said, "Take your time." Then he left the room. because grief and honesty need privacy to bloom. That evening, long after chores were done and the stew pot scraped clean, the barn filled with the sound of pencils moving across paper. It was not fast. It was not easy. Sentences broke. Words came in waves. Some lines were crossed out, others rewritten over and over. Sabine wept softly as she wrote. She did not try to hide it. Her letter read, "To my father, I do not know what I believed. I only know that I followed. I was afraid to ask questions. But I am asking them now. The Americans are not monsters. They are not saints. They are men who gave me warm bread. I do not know how to tell you that my enemy made me feel like a daughter again." Ilse hesitated for a long time before writing a single word. Then she wrote, "Dear Mama, we were wrong. They do not beat us. They give us cocoa. They call me by my name. I wash their clothes, and they thank me. Sometimes I forget that we are still at war." Lotta wrote to no one. Her mother was gone. Her brothers lost. So she wrote to the wind. A letter never meant to be mailed, folded gently and placed into the crack of the barn beam. It read, "I thought I would die with a hate in my heart. But today, a cowboy showed me how to saddle a horse. He smiled like I wasn't broken. He didn't ask my past, just asked if I liked apples. And I said yes. I think I really meant it." The next day, McBride collected the letters in silence. He did not read them. He didn't have to. He had seen the women's faces, the way they softened as the ink dried. That was proof enough. But something happened that afternoon he didn't expect. The women asked him to write one. "You've seen us," Elsa said. "Maybe someone should see you too." McBride blinked. "Ain't no one back home waiting on my letters." Helga stepped forward. "Then write to someone who doesn't know you yet. Say what this place is. Tell the truth before someone else lies about it." And so, under the cottonwood tree, he wrote, "To whoever reads this, I'm an American guard in a war that stopped making sense a long time ago. But here, on a cattle ranch in Texas, I've seen something sacred. I've seen women who were called enemies hang laundry beside men who lost brothers to their side. I've seen a loaf of bread make silence weep. I've seen fear stitched into kindness. If this letter survives the war, know this. They were human. So were we. That's all that mattered." The letters were tied with twine and delivered to the Army liaison in town. Not all would reach their destinations. Some would be censored, others would vanish, but none of that mattered. Because, for the first time, the women had spoken. Not propaganda, not submission, but truth. Their words had left the ranch. And with them, the weight of silence. That evening, Harlan hosted a supper under the open sky. No reason, no holiday. Just a long table, creaking with stew pots and bread and laughter. Candles were set in glass jars. The women braided their hair for the first time in months. One of the cowboys, Pete, the youngest, brought out a fiddle and played a crooked tune he called Sunday Storm. It didn't matter that the notes were off. It made them smile. Near the end of the evening, Sabine stood. Not by command, but by choice. She held up her tin cup. Her voice trembled but did not break. "To the Americans who treated us not like prisoners, but like people. To the names we almost forgot. And to the letters we dared to send, even if no one ever reads them." The table was quiet for a moment. Then came the clink of tin touching tin. "To truth," said McBride softly. "To mercy," whispered Elsa. And from Harlan, barely above the wind, to memory. That night, as the last candle guttered out, the wind carried with it a quiet promise that even in war, voices rise. Even in foreign soil, roots can grow. And somewhere, far across the sea, Perhaps a child would open a letter and learn that her mother was still alive. Not just in body, but in soul. Tomorrow, they would rise and hang new sheets on the fence. But tonight, they had found their voice. No wind, no cattle bells, no laughter from the barn loft. Just the sound of boots moving slow across dry earth, as if the land itself held its breath. A telegram had arrived that morning. Folded crisp, stamped U.S. War Department, delivered to Harlan, carried in both hands. He didn't say a word when he read it. He just sat on the porch, pipe unlit, eyes on the horizon. It was McBride who took the paper next. He read it once, then again. Then he lowered it to his lap, staring through it as if seeing something too far to name. Joe Talbot approached, hat in hand. "What is it?" McBride answered softly. "Private Samuel Bishop, killed in action, Normandy." Joe swallowed. "Pete's brother?" McBride nodded. 3 days ago, they just found the body. They told Pete after breakfast. He didn't speak, didn't cry. Just walked to the barn, climbed into the hayloft, and sat with his arms around his knees. The women heard the news soon after. They knew what a War Department telegram meant. They had seen too many. In doorways, on tables, in train stations. Death was a language they understood too well. Ilsa whispered. "They lost one of their own," Sabine murmured, "and now they'll remember we're not." A chill passed through the group. Old guilt stirred. The unspoken divide crept back. We and they. Then Elsa stood up, brushed flour from her apron, and said only, "We go." "Go where?" asked Lotta. "To stand with them." The Cowboys had gathered in front of the chapel, a small wooden shed the ranch used for Sunday scripture and quiet prayer. A single flag had been hung over the door, half-mast. Pete was still in the loft. They didn't call him down. Thomas Harlan stood near the porch, his Bible closed. He didn't open it. He said, "When a boy dies across the ocean, his name deserves to come home. He won't be buried here, but he'll be mourned here." Joe stepped forward, holding the folded flag, the one from above the porch. The women approached slowly, hands empty, eyes lowered. No one stopped them. They joined the circle, silent. 12 women in enemy uniforms standing beside American men in work shirts. A line that once divided nations now blurred in the dust. McBride looked up, just briefly, and met Helga's eyes. He gave the smallest nod. She returned it. There was no sermon, no hymns, only names. Thomas Harlan read from the paper, voice slow and clear. Private First Class Samuel Bishop, born Abilene, Texas, enlisted 1943, deployed Europe, killed June 18, 1944. That was all. The silence that followed felt longer than the war itself. Then Elsa stepped forward, uninvited, and held out something small, a linen handkerchief, white, edged with red thread, folded with care. She offered it to Pete's empty chair. Harlan looked at her. His face did not move, but his eyes did. He stepped forward and took it in both hands. "Danke," he said, then corrected himself. "Thank you." After the ceremony, no one returned to work. The horses stayed unsaddled. The stew remained uncooked. Instead, the ranch gathered under the cottonwoods, not to speak, just to sit. Ilsa picked up the Bible from the table and opened it. Not to preach, but to look. Her finger stopped on a verse she didn't know in English, but had heard once, whispered by her mother in a candlelit basement as bombs fell outside. She read it aloud, awkwardly, syllables bending. "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." McBride translated, softly, and the wind returned. That evening, Pete came down from the loft. He walked barefoot, his boots in his hand. His face was blotched, but dry. His steps slow, but steady. He came to the chapel and placed a single apple on the doorstep. Then he turned to the women and said, "He liked apples." Ilsa stepped forward and whispered, "So do I." Pete didn't smile, but he nodded. That night, He played his fiddle again. Just once. Just one song. A slow waltz no one recognized, and everyone understood. Later, Helga found McBride by the fire, polishing his boots again. She sat beside him. I thought when the war ended, there would be no more dying. He shook his head. Sometimes peace costs more than war. She looked toward the chapel. The flag had been folded again, placed on the altar. Do you think they'll let us mourn our dead too? McBride paused, then quietly, only if we let them mourn ours. Before bed, the women returned to the fence of names. Sabine brought a scrap of cloth, blue with gold thread, and stitched a new name. Samuel Bishop, age 19, June 1944. Under it, she wrote only 2 words, one of ours. No one argued, because in grief, the map folds. There are no borders, only names and silence, and the firelight of those who stayed to hold it. Tomorrow, they would rise again. Tomorrow, the cows would need feeding, the linens washing, the bread baking. But tonight, they sat together, cowboys and German women, in the stillness of loss. And the war, for just one evening, grew quiet. A military truck had come just after dawn. Green canvas, white star. No soldiers yet. Just the engine idling like a ticking clock. McBride hadn't said anything, but his eyes did. The orders had come in. The 12 German POW women were to be transferred to a new work detail, a formal army-run camp near San Antonio. Closer to regulation, more secure. Fewer cowboys, more fences. No one said the word goodbye. Not yet. In the kitchen, Helga stood over the stove, stirring broth. She moved slowly, as if every motion might anchor her to the room. Ilse sat at the table folding napkins. Sabine wiped down the counter, though it was already clean. Elsa, arms crossed, leaned near the window, staring at the dust spiraling outside. None of them had packed, and none of them asked. Why now? Because they already knew. Mercy isn't a permanent station. It's a borrowed hour, and their time had run out. It was McBride who broke the stillness. He stepped into the kitchen carrying a brown paper parcel. His voice was soft. "We cooked something." Sabine blinked. "We?" McBride glanced behind him. Joe stood awkwardly at the doorway, holding a pot roast. "It's Sunday," Joe muttered. "Figured we'd give you one more." Ilse swallowed. Her hands trembled. "Is it Christmas?" The question fell hard into the room, like truth does when wrapped in a child's hope. McBride hesitated, then stepped closer. "No, but we thought maybe it should feel like it." Outside, the men had laid the long table beneath the cottonwood one last time. The red-stitched napkins, tin cups, the mismatched chairs. The lanterns hung early, catching the wind. But this time the women served themselves. Helga placed the roast at the center. Elsa brought fresh bread. Ilse set out preserved fruit, a gift from Mary Ellen's pantry. And McBride, quietly, poured milk into each cup. No speeches were made. "Just one moment." Sabine stood. She lifted her cup and said, in clear English, "We thought it was Christmas, the first Sunday. We didn't understand." She looked at McBride, then at Harlan, at the Cowboys. Their boots worn, their hats folded in their laps. Now we know. It wasn't a holiday. It was grace. The table was still. Then came a quiet chorus of clinks as cups rose to meet hers. "Grace," murmured Joe. "Grace," echoed Helga. As the meal ended, the women stood from the table, one by one. Some wept, some smiled. Elsa reached for the napkin in her lap and folded it into a perfect triangle. She held it out to Pete. "Keep it," she said. Pete blinked. "But it's yours." "No," Elsa said. "It was never ours. It became ours. Because you gave it without asking why." The truck waited by the fence. The driver, a young man with no idea what had happened on this ranch, opened the rear flap and called out, "Let's go, ladies." The women didn't move right away. Instead, they turned, all 12, and walked once more to the fence of names. Each one carried a strip of cloth. Each had written something on it in their own hand. Ilse said, "Forgiven is not the same as forgotten." Sabines, "We carried war in our pockets, but we left it here." Lotta's, "They taught me apples. I will teach them peace." Helga's, pinned last, bore only 2 words: "Thank you." McBride stood by the tailgate as they climbed into the truck. He looked at each one, called them by name. Ilse, Sabine, Elsa, Greta, Lotta, Helga. Each nodded once, eyes locked. When he came to the last, Anna, the quietest, he hesitated. Then he stepped forward and placed something into her hand. It was a folded piece of bread. Wrapped in linen, still warm, she clutched it like a medal. "For the road," McBride said. The truck rumbled. The women took their seats, arms tight around their knees, backs pressed to the canvas wall. And then the ranch fell behind them. For a long time, no one spoke. Only the wind. Only the fading scent of roast. The faint starch of clean linens on their hands, and the memory of voices around a shared table. Ilse whispered. "They will never understand what they gave us," Helga answered. "Then we must remember it enough for them too." At the edge of the field, Joe turned back to the fence. The red threads fluttered like signals in the dusk. The names remained. The letters faded, but they were real. The women were gone, but the meal had happened. The kindness was not undone. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a square of paper. The photo of Samuel Bishop. He pinned it beside Sabine's fabric. Below it he wrote, "They ate with us. They wept with us. They mourned our dead. That makes them ours." The sun dipped low. The cottonwoods whispered, and in the silence that followed, one truth rose like smoke from that first pot roast. It was never about Christmas. It was about becoming human again, not through surrender, not through orders, but through a meal. A Sunday pot roast that said more than war ever could. Tomorrow, the ranch would return to its rhythms, but it would never be the same. Because grace once given cannot be unmade, and kindness, real, raw, undeserved, leaves a scar that heals, not wounds.